Hi, good afternoon. I hope everybody had a good lunch today. Welcome to Black Hat 2015 Briefings Day 1. Just a couple of announcements. There will be a reception tonight in the Business Hall at 5:30. That's located in Shoreline A. The Pawnee Awards are also this evening. Those are in Mandalay Bay, BCD at 6 p.m. You are in the room, Mandalay EF right now for the session Red versus Blue, Modern Active Directory Attacks, Detection and Protection. Sean Metcalf is your speaker. If that's where you intend to be, great. If not, now you know. Also, as with all talks, we really would prefer not to hear your super cool ringtone, so let's make sure our phones are on vibrate. And with that, Sean, I will allow you to take it away.
Thank you. Oops. Good afternoon. I'm Sean Metcalf, and this is Red versus Blue, Modern Active Directory Attacks, Detection and Prevention. It's a long title, but effectively we're going to talk about Active Directory attack and defense. I'm the CTO of Dan Solutions, which is a Microsoft solutions provider of engineering and security solutions. So I go into customers and talk to them about how they can secure their Microsoft enterprise, specifically Active Directory, and I do a lot of security research surrounding Active Directory, and I post that oftentimes to adsecurity.org. So the agenda is simple. We're going to show some attacks. Basically, there's a lot of conversation in the news and the media about malware. We're not going to talk about malware. We're going to talk about what happens once that malware gets on a computer and those attackers connect into that computer and use it as their jumping point. How does an attacker get from domain user to domain admin? We're going to talk about some of those techniques. So we know in the news we have breaches. It seems like every week there's another one that's announced. We hear about the malware, but how do they completely own an environment? Don't we have security to protect against this? Well, the issue is that our traditional security is easily bypassed. Why? Because we've been focusing on the perimeter for years. Our firewalls, our perimeter security devices are not doing what we need them to do today. Email goes right through it, right? Users get spearphished. Why do they click on links? Because they look like this. It's way too easy to get someone to click on a link or open up an attachment and then click on that little button that says enable content. What does that mean to a user? Nothing. To a user, that means click on this to see the content. Okay, we've trained them to do this. Verizon released their data breach investigation report last year, and it said, what? A lot of numbers. 70 to 90% of the malware that was used in these breaches was unique to that organization. 99.9%, almost 100% of the vulnerabilities exploited in these breaches had patches that came out a year before that. And 50% of the users in a spear phishing exercise actually opened up the email within an hour. All right, so we know email works, right? So let's talk about what the attackers are doing. The red team. What their motivations are. What are they after? Other than maybe, I don't know, sharks with freaking laser beams on their heads or something. What are attackers after? They want data. They want to grab the data from organizations, they want to put it out on the internet where they can access it, and they want to persist in the environment. Sometimes this includes privilege escalation, sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times it does. Why? Because it's too easy to get to domain admin. If you want to learn more about persistence, I highly recommend you go to Mac Raber's talk in this room at 420, because he'll talk about the advanced techniques that attackers are using today to persist in the network. PowerShell. A lot has been talked about in PowerShell the past few years. PowerShell is an integrated component in Windows. You cannot uninstall it on every version or every supported version of Windows that's out today. Why do attackers love PowerShell? Well, there's a bunch of toolkits they can use. But the coolest thing about PowerShell to an attacker is the fact that they can grab code off of a web server, have it download and execute in memory, and nothing touches disk. Antivirus will not stop this. We have Powersploit, invoke Mimikatz, injecting shellcode into memory, stealing tokens, reusing, injecting processes or executables into existing running process. Nishang is another one that's very similar with additional tools for recon in an environment. Power Up enables the attacker to identify who's logged on to what computer, with additional tools for reconning an Active Directory environment. And PowerShell Empire, which is being announced in about 5 minutes. PowerShell Empire, check it out. This is the evolution of PowerShell attacks. So when an attacker gets on a system, they have their malware there. They are operating as a domain user. Well, they could use a traditional method of getting information about the environment. What is that? Network port scanning, right? Hit a whole bunch of IPs on different ports and I get some information back. We don't need to do that anymore. Active Directory has all this information. Why would an attacker need to do a port scan? In order for a service to support Kerberos, there needs to be a service principal name associated with that account that provides that service, be it a service account or a computer account. Well, that information is in Active Directory. Service principal name, or SPIN, is formatted like this. You have the SPIN class, you have the server name, and with SQL, it even has the port number SQL is running on. Who here changes the SQL port in order to be a little more tricky, so that way no one knows what it is, right? It's right here in Active Directory. As a domain user, we can request this information. I can request it with PowerShell. I can spin scan for every SQL server in the domain or the forest by spin scanning. When I do this, I get information about every SQL server, including the port it's running on, or an instance name, the SQL service account that's there. So this means I can also spin scan for service accounts. Well, that's really useful. What if I can find the SQL service account that's the account that is the administrator on all of these SQL servers? Here I have 3. Okay, what can I do with that? Well, last year at DerbyCon, Tim Medine released a Python-based tool called Kerberos. If you're a defender, you're very scared of this. So he recognized that the way that Kerberos communication works is that the user types in their username and password, prove their identity to the domain controller, and the domain controller looks them up in AD and goes, okay, this user is a member of these groups, has these logon restrictions, etc. Builds a TGT, a ticket granting ticket. It's effectively the authentication ticket. It proves that user is that user to Active Directory, to the domain controller. So that TGT is delivered to the user turns around and gives it back to the domain controller. Says, I need a service ticket for this service principal name. AD doesn't care. It goes, all right, you have a valid TGT. I'm going to take the data out of the TGT, or effectively take your group membership, that information, put it into that service ticket. That service ticket is encrypted with the service account password that is running under the context of that service. So again, a user account or a computer. So what does this mean? This means that if an attacker requests a service ticket for a specific service principal name on the network, gets a service ticket for it using PowerShell. You can see on the bottom here that I have that service ticket. The domain controller doesn't care if I ever actually talk to that server. I'm going to get the service ticket anyway. So we can take that service ticket out of memory, save it using Mimikatz, or there's other tools to use, and then copy it up to the internet somewhere. I can use my attacker box on AWS or Azure or wherever, run the Kerberos tool against it, and what will happen is I can have a whole bunch of service account related service tickets and have Kerberos run through and brute force them based on my dictionary file. Why does this work? What is your domain password policy? What is the minimum? 8 characters, 10 characters, 12, 15? It needs to be 25 now, or higher. You don't want your service account to be the one that actually is the reason why your entire domain gets popped. Kerberos is way too easy to run because the attacker can crack those passwords offline, and they have months to do so. They can use a Bitcoin rig even to really get some good numbers. But there's also managed service accounts and group managed service accounts, which can be used so the AD will actually manage that password. It'll be a really long, complex password, which will never get cracked. So another problem we have is that group policy preferences, when it was released with Windows Server 2008 provided a great way for local admin account passwords to be changed on hundreds and thousands of computers. Great. It was AES 256-bit encrypted. That's how that password was stored. But Microsoft published the private key. So all an attacker has to do is scan this location, which is sysvol, look for XML files with a cpassword attribute, extract that AES encrypted blob that comes after it, and run an AES decrypt function against it, which we can use PowerShell for, leveraging that private key. So this means that a domain user can scan sysvol and potentially get the local admin account for thousands of computers in the environment. Don't use this. So mitigating this really comes down to ensuring that administrators are not putting credentials into group policy preferences. Microsoft has a patch for that. It has to be applied on every system where an admin could use the group policy management console to set that, to apply those credentials or set them into that policy. But that doesn't remove those passwords from group policy or from sysvol if they're already there. So you have to go through and scan them. Thankfully, this KB article has a scanner that Microsoft put out, which seems to be loosely based on the get GPP password in PowerSploit. But you didn't hear that from me. So how do we detect this? Well, the easiest way is to create an XML file, drop it into sysvol, which has some data and it doesn't really matter, but you set everyone deny access. And then you set auditing on it. And that way, when someone's scanning through sysvol, you get an alert, you get an event on your DC that you can trigger off of. So the other issue is when every computer account or local account in a domain or across a lot of computers has the same account name and password, specifically administrator accounts. Because Windows is very nice about these things. When there's a computer account over here, a computer over here, and a computer over here, they have the same local admin account name and password, it works across the network. So the whole local thing is a bit of a misnomer. So how do you protect that? Well, two different parts. One, you have to make sure that your local admin account passwords are randomized. You want to make sure that they're unique across all your computers in your enterprise, because obviously compromising one computer enables an attacker to compromise others. The second part is you can install the KB 2871997 patch, which is effectively a security backport from Windows 2012 R2 and Windows 8.1, and it adds some local SIDs to the computers. These local SIDs say this is a local user on this computer, and you can create a group policy that prevents the local SIDs from logging in across the network to another computer. So I'm pretty sure everyone here is familiar with Mimikatz, right? I call it the credential multi-tool. Because it can dump all the credentials, including Kerberos tickets, reuse them, generate golden tickets, silver tickets, forged tickets, whatever you want. And based on the access, you can get all of them or the current users. So this is what it looks like. On the left, you have an admin, Han Solo, who's a great server admin. He's logged on to this server. The server's been compromised, which means that now his account is compromised. On the right side, we all have service accounts, right? We all have services that run across a large number of computers. We have that because we have vendors that say, here's this product that does all this great stuff for you. Fantastic. What rights does this service account need? Domain admin. Okay, I want that functionality. But the problem is that if a service is running under the context of a service account, those credentials are in LSAS, which means Mimikatz can dump them. So if you're running a service on workstations that has domain admin rights to your domain, you're not going to have a good day in the future, if you haven't already. And you'll notice that the clear text password is there also. Well, if you install that backport patch, KB 2871997, it will enable you to set a reg key so that password isn't stored in LSAS. So let's talk about Kerberos a little bit. If there are any Kerberos nerds in the house, like myself, you're familiar with the double hop issue. When Active Directory was released, Microsoft said, let's use Kerberos. Great. Problem is that a service ticket the user gets for the web server does not work on the database server. So how did they fix this? Came up with unconstrained delegation. You've probably seen this, that box in the middle. That's unconstrained delegation. Constrained delegation is the one below it, which constrains that delegation or that impersonation to specific services running on specific servers. You can find these servers or systems or accounts by using PowerShell. That first box that I've highlighted, that's unconstrained delegation. After this talk, if you have any of those in your environment, you know you want to get rid of them. The second box is constrained delegation. That's much better. Why is unconstrained delegation so bad? Well, let's go back to the Kerberos diagram. When the user requests that service ticket for that service running on that server which has unconstrained delegation, the domain controller takes the copy of the user's TGT and puts it into that service ticket and delivers it back to the user, because unconstrained delegation is configured for that server or account. So when the user provides that service ticket to the server that's hosting that service, that TGT is placed into LSAS, is placed into memory. See why this is bad? I've found environments that still have unconstrained delegation enabled. And it wouldn't take much to social engineer a domain admin like good old Luke Skywalker to connect to the server over a Kerberos service. He doesn't have to type in his credentials. He just needs to connect to a network share. And you see at the top, this is a network session. But we have this user's TGT, which then we pass the ticket. And using PowerShell remoting, we can connect to a domain controller, and we can dump the Kerb TGT account password hash, which means we can create golden tickets now. The best and easiest way to fix this is don't use unconstrained delegation. The other one is to check this box on your admin accounts. So attackers want to dump the domain credentials so that way they can be anyone they want or maybe create golden tickets. So the first way to do that is find the ntds.dit file, that Active Directory database file. The other way is to steal credentials. So where would the DIT be? So everyone in an environment or a domain admin or security people for an organization, do you know where your DIT is? Maybe not. Backups of your domain controllers. Any external storage for the domain controller, such as a network device like a NAS or a SAN or even just a bunch of disks. Well, who administers your virtual environment which has and hosts your virtual DCs? Do you consider them domain admins? Well, you probably should. In VMware, if I'm a VMware admin, I can clone a virtual DC within VMware, and once I have that clone, I don't need to start it, I can copy down the storage files associated with that cloned DC. No alarm bells are going to go off in AD, and no alarm bells are going to go, no events are going to be triggered on a DC or on a Windows system, because I don't even start that up. I can delete that cloned VM after I pull those files down. Now, if I'm an attacker and I get on a mission-sensitive box, I may not want to use a hacker tool or, Mimikatz or something like that. Well, I can use Task Manager and dump LSAS into an LSAS dump file. And I can copy that off somewhere else and run Mimikatz against it there. It's going to be a little more difficult to discover that I was on that box. But that LSAS dump file may actually have the domain admin credentials in it. And so what it looks like once I get to the domain controller or have access to it where I can dump the credentials, I'm going to have those NTLM password hashes. Or I can use NTDS-util. What's NTDS-util? It's a tool used by administrators to administer the Active Directory database or manage it. So when domain controllers are being stood up, especially when there's a large number of them, or you have a branch office scenario where the bandwidth isn't great, when you run DC promo, that server has to copy from another domain controller all the domain information. But if we use NTDS-util to create and install from MediaSet or IFM, it makes a copy of the DIT for us. So an attacker could use this, or go looking for an IFM on the network. So in an environment where you have a domain controller that you need to stand up, and you have a server that's already staged, you may drop an IFM on there, but that server's not a DC yet, so it may not be secured in the same way. And there may even be an IFM on the network somewhere, in a share. But the key point to this is once an attacker has access to the DIT file, they own your domain, because they can dump all the credentials. And the one I've highlighted is the Kerb TGT one, which means, again, I can create golden tickets. Well, what can I do with NTLM hashes? I can pass the hash, but there's some detection for that. But last year on the stage, Benjamin Delpy and Skip Duckwall in their golden ticket talk talked about overpass the hash. And by clearing out all the Kerberos encryption keys that are on that system and injecting that NTLM password hash, I can take that password hash and switch it over so that I'm using a Kerberos ticket, which is a lot more difficult to detect. Just Sunday, Benjamin Delpy released DC Sync, which is part of his Kekio suite. What is this? A lot of people were confused. Some people got it right away. He describes it as such. Hey, I'm a DC. Send me the password hashes for these accounts. And the DC does it using standard official APIs that Microsoft has published. You have to be a domain admin to do it, but this is going to be the next method of how people are pulling hashes, password hashes, which includes the old passwords for accounts, which could be interesting for a variety of reasons. Yeah, I agree with Brad Pitt. That's kind of an issue. So how do you detect this? It's very difficult. There's a lot of different methods. Ultimately, it comes down to protecting your DC storage, the DIT file, any DC backups, protecting the credentials, and ultimately separating your domain admins or your admin accounts on the network from the other systems. So last year in November, Microsoft released an out-of-band patch for Kerberos because the domain controllers weren't properly validating the PAC. PAC is the Privilege Attribute Certificate, which stores the group membership information within the Kerberos ticket. Kind of important. So Gavin Millard of Tenable tweeted about this, what I thought was the best example of how this works, and I've been explaining this to executives using this exact analogy. You have a boarding pass, you get on the plane, but before you get on the plane, you take a Sharpie and write pilot. You hand it to the flight attendant. And as you get on the plane, you're escorted into the cockpit, and then you're asked if you want coffee before you take off, Captain. So this enables the rewriting of a ticket effectively from domain user to domain admin in about 5 minutes. PyKek came out 2 weeks after the patch was released. Python script in order to exploit this vulnerability. The way it works is it requests a TGT with no PAC. Once it gets that, it creates a forged PAC signed with the user's password data. Then it's sent back, that TGT and that forged PAC is sent as an authenticator. The DC looks at it and goes, oh, okay, so you're requesting a service ticket with no PAC, and you have a TGT with no PAC, but you have an authenticator. You know what? I'm just going to take this authenticator, put it into a new TGT. That's the PAC. There you go. Golden ticket accomplished. Benjamin Delpy updated this earlier this year as part of his Kekio suite, where it actually scans for vulnerable DCs. Once it finds it, it exploits it. And then it does one more thing at the end where it actually requests a delegation ticket. So now that exploit ticket works against any DC, not just unpatched ones. So yeah, user to admin in 5 minutes. So the response to this is going to be simple. Make sure that your server images, your server builds, are patched with this patch. That way, when you're standing up a new DC, you can be fairly certain that the patch is already there. Or preferably run this anyway before you run DC promo. It should be part of your steps, your QA process. Because if you stand up a new DC that's not patched against this, 5 minutes to domain admins. So a lot has been talked about with golden tickets. I'm not going to add to that, except to say that this step in the Kerberos process is missing with golden tickets. And the attacker has to have dumped the KERB-TGT account password hash in order to be able to create them. Now, there was somewhat of a limitation, if you could call it that, when golden tickets were released last year. When you dump that KERB-TGT account password hash, that golden ticket only works within that domain where it was created. And so if there's other domains in the forest, that golden ticket won't provide admin access to those. Well, now it can. Golden tickets are now more golden. I did some security research on SID history and its use in exploitation, and I talked to Benjamin Delpy. He added SID history to golden tickets in a roundabout way. I had asked to add it to Mimikatz, and now golden tickets support SID history. What's SID history? It enables you to add another SID from another domain that isn't associated with that user in this domain, and it gets evaluated as part of whether or not that user should have access, or determining access for resources. So as you can see on the bottom, this golden ticket works across every domain in that environment. So silver tickets, kind of overshadowed by the big brother golden ticket, right? What's interesting about a silver ticket is if the attacker gets the password data for a service running on that server, you can generate a silver ticket, or that forged service ticket, for that service. There's no communication with the domain controller, so if you're only pulling security events off your DCs, you're going to miss this. And there is a scenario where silver tickets can be more dangerous than golden tickets. So in a breach recovery scenario where an attacker has dumped everything, and then the corporate IT goes through the very painful process of changing all the account passwords, the item that gets missed is changing the computer account passwords, because every computer has an account password in Active Directory that ties that physical computer to AD. And that computer account password is what's used to encrypt that service ticket for that service on that Windows server or system. So if we have the computer account passwords for the domain controllers, we can create a silver ticket for the SIFT service on that domain controller, which says we're a domain admin, connect to the C$ share, or whichever we want, copy up our exploit script, create another silver ticket for the host service, which is a catch-all service of a bunch of different Windows services that run on that system, and then we can create a scheduled task. We can replace an existing scheduled task, or we can create a new one. We'll call it something innocuous, like SCOM agent health check. Then what happens? Well, re-exploit the domain. And this is a file on that computer's C drive or wherever, so we can access it. There's another type of ticket, or forged ticket. So we've talked about within Active Directory. Between Active Directory forests, or domains, we have trusts. Blue domain admin creates a trust using a trust password. They send it over, usually via email, to the green domain admin who types in the same one. Well, that trust password doesn't change for 30 days, so if an attacker saw that email or overheard them talking about it and knew what that password was, the attacker could create their own trust ticket, which is that cross-forest, basically a TGT, which says who they are. So that attacker can say, I am this user, a member of these groups in the blue domain, and just pass that ticket, that trust ticket, that forged trust ticket over to the green domain, and get access to any resources in the green domain that were permissioned to resources from the blue domain. Now, if this happens in an Active Directory forest, well, they just pass a trust ticket that says they're an enterprise admin, and then they fully compromise the green domain. So detection is difficult. Mitigation, protect AD admins. I'll get into that a little bit more. Earlier this year, I identified some key indicators on how to detect forged tickets, specifically golden and silver tickets. In April, late April of this year, Benjamin Delpy updated Mimikatz, so that string at the end is what shows up in that domain field now. Identified anomalies in the domain field. That still may work, but I suspect the attackers have gotten better. Those are the events at the bottom. So I know defense often feels like 300 versus 300,000. But there are some ways to help protect your environment. When we're talking about PowerShell attacks and how to detect them, it starts with logging. PowerShell version 3 and newer supports something called module logging, which you can enable via group policy. So that way, any command that's executed in PowerShell is logged to the PowerShell event log. You can pull that back into your SIM tool. You definitely want to look for some of these activities because they are very interesting. Attackers will use the .NET web client in order to pull down code or files, use invoke expression to execute those, use encoded command in order to ensure that it's obfuscated, it's difficult to see, it's base64 encoded. And then there's a couple other things that are interesting, but I like to focus on PowerShell remoting. So you can enable PowerShell remoting on systems that support it, which again is every modern OS. And it leverages WinRM. You'll want to disable PowerShell remoting on any system that doesn't need it, because by default it's not enabled except when you get to 2012 R2. But you can limit it. You can limit the listener that WinRM, or you can limit the scope of that listener that WinRM has. Limit it to your admin subnets. And when you limit it, you control who has access to it. Because as we've seen, if someone can grab credentials for an admin, they can connect in and do some interesting things with it. The other part is auditing and metering PowerShell usage. You can audit PowerShell using either SCCM, or you can use AppLocker in audit mode. SCCM gives you some really interesting software metering capability with PowerShell, so you can do some trend analysis on who's actually using it in your environment. You can use other software metering tools. I'm just picking on the Microsoft folks. So once you see this trend analysis, you can see that a user has run PowerShell on 10 different computers in the past 2 hours. Maybe that's a problem. In PowerShell version 5, things get a little bit better. You have script block logging, which looks like this. Those obfuscated commands that I mentioned earlier are deobfuscated, decrypted, before PowerShell runs them. So PowerShell will take that data and send it to the event log. And so now we can have some really interesting SIM alerts when it comes to PowerShell attacks, or interesting PowerShell code that was run. We also get system-wide transcripts, which means that we can enable this via group policy. We can have a share on the network and have these system transcripts get sent automatically to that share where they can't be modified or deleted later, and have our SIM tool like Splunk or something else ingest those logs, those transcript files, and get some really interesting information about who's doing what as a step above the event logging. Constrained PowerShell is PowerShell in constrained language mode, which is the core of PowerShell. So PowerShell enables all this advanced functionality, all this power. It has the ability to leverage .NET functions, do WMI things, a bunch of other things. But the important note of this is that if we have PowerShell v5 in our environment, which has been backported or fully supported in Windows 7 2008 R2 at some point, we can enable AppLocker in allow mode, which automatically sets PowerShell to constrained mode with PowerShell v5. So this means that these advanced attacks don't work like they usually do, because they leverage the more advanced functionality of PowerShell. Windows 10, the story gets better. I know it's going to be a little while before everyone gets there, but there's the anti-malware scan interface in Windows 10. So before PowerShell executes code, be it pulled down from a website, typed in manually, in the PowerShell ISE selected and hit run, or run from a script, PowerShell is going to kick that over to the AMSI and wait for it to come back with the status OK. If it doesn't get that, PowerShell is not executing code in Windows 10. So that malware scan interface or that malware solution or anti-malware solution that's on that box is going to be looking for code snippets, so-called signatures, but it can also do URL reputation. So that way, if that code is attempting to be executed from a server on the internet, you can see that. So now I'm going to summarize the mitigation levels. This is what I call low difficulty. You should ensure that there are no user accounts in your environment that are a member of admin groups. It's obvious. We've known this. I keep finding environments where this is the case. Why? Because of group nesting. We nest this group and this group, this group, this group, and then people forget what the groups do. We want to set that group policy to ensure that even if a local admin account is compromised and we still have passwords that are the same across multiple systems, that the attacker can't jump from one to the other. So we also want to ensure that we protect our service accounts by using long, complex passwords and pushing back on our vendors to say that we don't need elevated rights. Last year, there were a couple patches that were released that improved RDP. So historically, RDP, you would connect in, you would type in your explicit credentials into that RDP box. They'd be sent over to that server that you're connecting to, and they'd be placed in LSAS. So they'd be in memory there, which could be stolen. Restricted admin mode doesn't place those credentials on that box. It converts your interactive logon into effectively a network connection. And so they're not there waiting for someone. So we move on to level 2. It's important today to ensure that you use a tool to automatically rotate and randomize and have unique local administrator account passwords on every computer in your environment. Because again, it's too easy for attackers to leverage that information to jump around. It doesn't matter what tool it is, but Microsoft Laps is available and it works better than what we've had. It's free. The other thing to note is that even if you have your administrators isolated, you've randomized that, if users on one workstation or a user on one workstation connect to workstations all over your environment, you may be in a situation where those credentials that are on those workstations can be compromised, especially if they have the local admin account password. But it enables the attacker to move around your environment in ways that you may not be aware of. And on Sunday, there's going to be a tool release called Pivoter, which enables attackers to jump around like that using user credentials. So you definitely want to look at how to limit and restrict communication when it comes to workstations in your environment. We've had a flat network for too long. And part of that includes looking at the server side as well and having some network isolation so that way when you have your back-end financial database or HR database or your badge system, that those aren't available for anyone on your network to connect to them. So separating your admins from your users is very important, making sure that you limit where your domain admins or your Active Directory admins actually log on, what they're able to do. Which brings us to what I call the it's complicated phase of mitigation. This is difficult, but this is where we need to get to. We need to make sure that our domain admins group is now empty. I know that's tough. The problem is the domain admins has been around since NT. Domain admins usage for managing an enterprise is 1990s mentality, and we need to get away from it. We need to identify what the roles are in our organizations, figure out who needs what access, who needs to do what. Because I've been in organizations where the Exchange admins are domain admins. That's way too powerful. Domain admins have full admin rights to Active Directory, domain controllers, all workstations, all servers, everything. It's way too easy for an attacker to compromise one account and compromise an entire domain or forest. So we need to make sure that our Active Directory admins, because we're not calling them domain admins anymore, only can authenticate or log on to certain workstations, admin workstations that are protected at a higher level than what your standard users are going to be on. We want to make sure that these domain admins or Active Directory admins only log on to domain controllers or special servers like admin servers, special workstations. We also want to look at our server admins to make sure that they're following something similar. Because if a credential is stolen for a server admin, but our domain admins we're still having domain admins out there, are logging in, then the problem is that they have access to those credentials as well. So in Windows 10, there's some new architecture to prevent against credential theft. This slide is actually out of date now as of this morning. I went to the Microsoft briefing and saw that all the stuff that I had based this slide on pretty much has changed from May, which is when I put this together. But the architecture is effectively the same. What was your traditional Windows OS is now the high-level OS in a blue box. And there's a new green box. These both run on a hypervisor by default. Well, not exactly by default. The information is coming out from Microsoft soon. But the important thing to note here is that LSASS is not going to store those credential secrets anymore. They're going to be over in the green box, referred to as the IUM or VSM. I heard recently that we have secure world versus normal world. There's some new terms like CredGuard to protect the credentials. But the important thing to take away from this slide is that the secrets that have been historically stolen and taken and reused in passive credential scenarios are not in LSASS anymore, are not in the traditional OS, which means that even if the kernel is compromised in that blue box, those credentials are not available for the attacker to reuse. So with more sophisticated attacks, we need better detection. To this end, Microsoft bought a company called Arado last year. They've incorporated the product and technology into a new product that Microsoft has releasing this month called Microsoft Advanced Threat Analytics. I don't work for Microsoft, but I'm excited about this because this is where we need to go. This will provide some useful visibility in our enterprises. Now, if you work for a very large enterprise and you have an enterprise client license or a CAL and you have software assurance, this may be included in that. So you want to ask your Microsoft rep. But effectively, it works very differently than how Microsoft has traditionally focused on security and looking at events. ATA works with an ATA sensor called the gateway that taps into a network switch or switches that fronts your domain controllers. And it watches the authentication traffic between the domain controllers and the clients. It takes that interesting traffic and sends it over to the ATA center, which then crunches those numbers and figures out that these users, or this specific user, logs on to this computer or these computers and these resources. And it builds a user behavior profile for every individual user in the environment. But it does this without looking at or parsing any event logs, and it does it without installing a client application or code on all your systems, because it's looking at the authentication traffic. So that means that it can also detect recon activities and the attacks that are very difficult to detect when you're just looking at event logs. And the detection at the bottom, those are very difficult to detect in event logs. So let's see what this looks like. This is the base console. So you see identity theft based on abnormal behavior. This user who's typically logged on to a couple different computers is logged on to several more than that, has attempted to access or has requested access to a number of resources that have never been seen before. This is your standard behavioral analysis. ATA adds to that and looks at deterministic components as well, kind of the essence of what an attack looks like, what's known bad. And so if you dig into this, you can see the additional information about what is behind this flag, this alert. ATA will only flag on the bad things, the known bad things. So I'm very excited about this. Credential theft. Pass the hash. How do we detect pass the hash now? Event logs, right? Maybe we identify some suspicious activity over here. What about pass the ticket? Ooh, that's tough. Not really sure how exactly we'd find that in event logs other than doing some correlation that this user logged on here and now they're over here. Overpass the hash, which I mentioned earlier, taking that NTLM password hash and converting it into Kerberos tickets, that's really tough. And the MS14068 exploit, that forged pack, ATA sees that as well, in addition to the golden ticket. And skeleton key. So skeleton key was announced earlier this year by Dell SecureWorks. It was in-memory malware that was discovered on a domain controller or domain controllers in an organization where it was patching LSAS. What was really interesting about this is it patched LSAS in a way that there was a master password for every user in the enterprise. So if everyone here is in an enterprise, if I patch that DC with skeleton key and I know the master password, I can log in as any of you. And you still continue logging in like normal because your password still works. We can detect that. So I have a few additional mitigations, which are more general. Some of these are obvious, but blocking internet access to systems that don't require it seems pretty obvious. Ensuring that computer account passwords get changed when there's a breach recovery scenario. Changing the KERB-TGT account password on a regular basis, and especially when an Active Directory admin leaves, or if you suspect that a backup was compromised. The KERB-TGT account, as mentioned before with golden tickets, stores two passwords, the current and the previous one. So that means that a backup from 4 years ago could still have a valid KERB-TGT account password in it. And you want to model your defenses against what the real threats are, what adversaries are actually doing out in the world. So in summary, at some point, there will be bad code running on a system in your network. What happens, what they're able to do, how they're able to escalate, how they're able to move around, what data they're able to access is entirely dependent on your defensive posture. How well you've implemented the mitigations, how well you have identified, we're going to protect these credentials because they're important. But it is possible to secure your environment. That's been my time. Thank you so much for yours. No? Maybe? So I just want to point out, these are great resources here on the left. Please follow them on Twitter. Great resources, very helpful. And I have time for questions as well. Please submit an evaluation. Okay. Questions? Right here. Okay. So the question is, in the newer versions of Microsoft Windows and Windows Server, there are mitigating security enhancements that mitigate or implement some of these things I've talked about. I haven't mapped those out, but certainly running newer OSs is generally better than older ones, which is why getting XP in 2003 is highly recommended in the environment. But yeah, I'd be interested. Thanks for the suggestion. I think I might look at that. Any other questions? Right over here. SID filtering for the trust exploit. That is a good question. So SID filtering will mitigate against SID history on that trust ticket if it's being used, but if it's not, it won't filter it out because it's looking at the SID history attribute. And in an Active Directory domain, or Active Directory forest, when you have multiple domains, you're not going to have SID filtering between those. So unfortunately, that's not going to help. But I highly recommend you use SID filtering on external trusts and also look at selective authentication, because that helps as well. Questions? Yes?
Have you dealt with the domain backup key yet that's stored on the DC as a secret?
The domain backup key, have I dealt with it yet? No, honestly, I haven't delved into that yet.
It's actually protected by the sys key, stored as a special secret in the AD. Mm-hmm. And once you have it, all the users' encryption keys are being escrowed with that particular key. It's a public key.
That's right.
Public-private key.
Right. So basically the conversation is surrounding the fact that whenever users are encrypting data on their system using DPAPI, there's effectively a recovery key or escrow key that's stored in Active Directory that's protected by the domain master backup key that this gentleman is referring to. And once you have access to that, you can decrypt all the user's data. It's a very good point. I haven't looked into that just yet because I've been busy with this stuff, but that's on my list.
Yeah, the AD doesn't release it because it's one of its intrinsic secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And on the NTDS.bit, it's actually protected with a sys key.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It is protected with a sys key. I didn't cover that due to time. So you get the NTDS.dit, you get the sys key or that other file. It's stored in the registry. You grab those, then yes, you can decrypt the NTDS.dit.
So one way to also harden it is if you have another sys key mechanism on your primary PC that cannot be easily slurped out.
Absolutely. So if you have an additional syskey method, such as a USB drive, floppy drive was historically what was used to ensure that the DC wouldn't decrypt its data without that additional method mechanism. Absolutely. I have 2.5 more minutes for questions. Any other questions? If there are no other questions, G-Packing is in here at 3 o'clock, so you may want to hold your seat. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.